Hey folks, welcome to another live. Today I want to sort of riff, right? I want to um, chat a little bit about my academic work and how it sort of overlaps with my work as a health coach and why I have the approach as a health coach that I do. So um, when we look at, first of all, I think we have to begin. My professor, shout out to Professor Rasigan Maharaj, who's taught me a lot over the past few years. He always begins at the dawn of humanity. You can ask him to speak about anything, and he'll say that biologically modern humans have existed for 350,000 years, more or less, give or take. That's what we believe to have happened. And we believe that they evolved in the continent of Africa, specifically in the area of what is today Kenya, Tanzania, not far from Mount Kilimanjaro, right? You could even go back further in time than that, and you could say that we, as we currently exist, we are the result of millions of years of evolution, right? Millions of years of pressure demands. And I would just add, when you think about evolution, most people think about evolution as a slow process, like, I don't know, a monkey gradually becomes a human. That's not at all accurate. Like, what I just said is wrong. It is true that members of the simian family, who we today call monkeys, and members of our genus, which is Homo, have a common ancestor some millions of years ago, right? And then what would have happened is selection pressures that are applied selectively. So something that happens really quickly put pressure and diverged our lines into two different places based on two different geographic locations, most likely, right? What usually happens, in my opinion, is really climate change. There are these shifts that the Earth goes through for a variety of reasons. Now we're living through one at the moment. And as the result of those shifts, the species that come under huge pressure, and most of our ancestors at that point would have died off, and some few remain. Okay, so what I'm describing when I'm talking about millions of years of evolution, that's a long process that involves every species on the planet and so on. But most species on the planet, so we can look at some species that are super highly selective. So think about the panda, which really only exists in one specific area within China, or something like the orangutan, which exists in maybe two or three islands at the moment, Sumatra and Kalimantan, in what is today Indonesia. Though, those animals may have been within a wider range at one certain point in time, but they only exist there at this moment, right? Now, many species, for example, a tiger, you have Indian varieties of tiger and Chinese varieties of tiger and so on. So some species are actually more wide-ranging. So when we talk about an animal, we have to think about, okay, where did it evolve? What are the characteristics that it evolved for, et cetera, et cetera. And that's why when we take our pets to the veterinarian, if we take a dog to the vet, it's pretty clear, like that the doctor will always ask you, what have you been feeding this animal, right? And it's the first question they're going to ask if there's any illness. And if the answer comes back, well, I've been feeding it donuts, the doctor is going to look at you in such a way that he thinks you're negligent, because you are, right? You shouldn't be feeding a dog jelly donuts, right? So in the case of the dog, it's very easy, because dogs evolved with humans, and dogs evolved on a certain diet, and the diet that dogs eat is not really in question, right? Now, the problem with humans, or the advantage that we had as humans, is that when you compare us with, say, dogs or cats or lions or any of these things, bears even, our physical characteristics are not very strong. We're not the strongest animal. We're not the fastest animal. We're not the quickest animal. We don't have much in the way of physical. We don't have the sharpest teeth, et cetera, et cetera. But what we do have is this: we have a brain. We have a brain that is far outsizes any other brain of mammals, of monkeys, and so on, right? So we use that brain to become the dominant species first in Africa and then on the rest of the planet, right? And humans currently, or say a few thousand years ago even, humans were inhabiting every continent on the Earth, including Australia, with the exception of Antarctica, right? So humans were in every area, including in Polynesia, including the Pacific Islands, which may have been the last place to be settled by humans. Okay. And how do we do that? So how do we go from the deserts of Namibia, not far from where I am here in Johannesburg, how do we go from some of the most inhospitable climates in the world? How do humans live there and also live up north? And the answer is that we have something called culture, right? Now, in the culture discussion comes the food discussion. What do I mean by that? I mean, if this is, the United Nations also recognizes this in the various conventions around the right to food. If I feed someone in Siberia the traditional foods of Africa, that is still giving them a starvation diet. That is not acceptable food, okay, according to the United Nations, right? You have to feed people a culturally appropriate diet or get them access to culturally appropriate foods, right? So the diet in Siberia, which is mostly raw meat, is very different from the diet where my ancestors lived in Gujarat, which is mostly cooked meat and some grains, right? Which is also very different from the diet here in Southern Africa, which was millets and some meats and so on, right? So these cultural shifts allowed us to adapt. And of course, if you're in Polynesia or something like that, there will be much more fish, maybe things like walrus and whale meat on the diet as well. So these cultural shifts allowed humans to survive in a variety of different climates. And in at least one case, that is the case of the Inuit people in the north of North America and Greenland and other places, seems to have led to a genetic shift as well. And I won't talk about the genetic shift, but it's an interesting one. But with that exception, our genes are more or less the same in all of the continents, right? So in other words, the genotype didn't change, but the phenotype changed. Phenotype meaning what the animal is actually doing. So again, using the example of, say, a vegetarian household in India and some of the people that I visited here in Southern Africa, the so-called Khoisan people who call themselves Bushmen, those folks the Bushmen are eating mostly meat whenever they can, whenever they're allowed to, and the Indian vegetarian isn't eating any meat, but they have the same genes, right? They have the same genes. Now, why is this important? Because, see, in the context of what I would say a real food diet, so the diet that most of us were eating a few hundred years ago, none of this matters that much. Because we have those adaptations, we were able to survive on, as long as we were getting adequate nutrients, which are, by the way, what are the adequate essential nutrients we need? We need essential amino acids. Those are essential proteins. And we need essential fatty acids, essential fats, right? There's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Okay, so that's what's clear. As long as the Indian vegetarian is getting enough protein from his or her diet, no issues. Now, the problem is in the modern context, with the desire to feed people cheap food in order to maximize profit. That's really what's going on in the modern context. It has nothing to do. People think it's about starvation and the ability to feed people and so on, and maybe that's part of it. But most of it is just capitalism. It's just supply and demand. It's just how can we manufacture food in such a way that we can make the most profit off of it, right? So once you understand that that's what's going on, then you have to say, okay, look, we actually need to get back to basics. Maybe there are deep things going on with disease. Maybe there are things that require medications. Maybe people need. Today, I was talking with a new client. He's been on steroids for a while, and he doesn't like the steroids. He's having bad reactions to them, and so on. Maybe in some cases, people need to be on steroids, right? No harm with that. But if you haven't tried to fix the diet first, if you haven't tried to put that person on an ancestrally appropriate diet, just like if you take your dog and you say to the vet, "I want to give this dog an injection," the vet is going to ask you, first of all, well, what have you been feeding the dog? Are you feeding it a proper diet? And if you feed it a proper diet and then it's still sick, yeah, then we gotta consider other things, no doubt about it, right? So that's the dogs. Everyone knows about the dogs in the diet. Everyone knows about the cats in the diet. Everyone knows about even any kind of pet you have. If you take it to the vet, the first thing they're going to ask you is the diet. But when we're talking about humans, we need to be careful about that too. We need to talk about the human diet, right? But then that begs the question, what is the human diet? Because there's so many different cultures. And so here we have to go back again to first principles, which is like, yeah, okay, all the cultural stuff is fine. It's going to be fine as long as you never left that culture, as long as you never started introducing massive amounts of sugar, massive amounts of artificial food dyes, massive amounts of seed oils, and so on into your diet. Your culture is your diet's probably going to be fine. You're probably going to be healthy. But once your health breaks down, we have to go back and say, okay, what is the universal culture? Universal culture is not the right term, but what is sort of the primordial culture, if you want to use that term, that humans may have come out of, if there is such a thing. Now, I as an academic, I'm very skeptical about this idea. Is there one culture from which we all evolved? But again, a biologist would say, look, if you had those roadblocks, if most of our ancestors died at a certain point and those who were left somehow had selection pressure to become modern Homo sapiens, what that means is there was a small culture or a small series of cultures in Southern Africa at a certain point in time. And we are all descendants of that small group of people, right? And we know from the evidence of places like Mossel Bay and so on that seafood was part of the diet, no doubt about it. And we know from a long chain of anthropological evidence that meat was a big part of the diet, right? And in fact, it was a huge part of the diet. So, hey, John, good to see you, man. It's been a little while. Hope everything's good in Washington, D.C. Um, so once you understand that this is what's going on from an evolutionary perspective, from a biological perspective, then we can say, look, maybe putting you on a diet that mimics what our ancestors ate, which wasn't 100% meat, but which was largely a meat-based diet, maybe that's going to fix things. Maybe it's not, but it's a first step. Again, putting your dog on the right diet may not fix your dog completely, but it's a first step. And it's a necessary step. If you don't take that first step, what I see in some of these forums and so on that I'm part of and sometimes participate in is people are posting their own anecdotes, right? And they're like, dude, I took this and I took that, and my X got better and my Y got better, and or it got worse. B vitamin seems to be a big thing. People are taking B vitamins and getting better. People are taking B vitamins and getting worse. Like, it's a mess, right? So what I'm saying is, before you do any of that, maybe you'll need to do some of that. Maybe you'll need to work with an expert like myself in order to tweak this stuff. But before you do any of that, can we find you a diet that is similar to an ancestral diet for humans, right? And once you've done that, once you've tried that, if you are still sick, then we can talk further about those little tweaks and so on. But until we do that, until we utilize a first principles approach, we don't actually have a starting point because we don't know what the hell you're doing. Our ancestors certainly didn't evolve with, this is another discussion I was having with someone about Ozempic and so on. I mean, the problem in our diet is not lack of Gila monster or venom in our diet. Like, I guarantee you. Ozempic, for those who don't know, is derived from the venom of Gila monsters, right? And listen, nothing against Ozempic. It seems to be a good drug. I'm writing an article about it, which is kind of coming down kind of in favor of it. But at least in the right use case for people with type 2 diabetes, for people with obesity, and so on. But we can't just assume that the drug is going to make up for a bad diet. You need to be on the right diet first. Again, using first principles, what is an ancestrally appropriate human diet based on the evidence we have of humans living, hundreds of thousands of years, from 350,000 years ago to 12,500 years ago, prior to the advent of modern agriculture. How did humans eat? We have pretty good answers to that question. At least try to get close to that within your own context, and only then do we look at things like supplements, medicines, whatever else may be there. Thank you for the comments. Keep them coming in. Situnet says, yes, sir, a large fraction of humans didn't eat grains or seeds because they understood it makes you sick. Other cultures ate seeds and grains because of their state of being. Yeah, this is a point that I make in other talks as well, which is that when we think about agriculture and the role of agriculture and so on, agriculture evolved in the context of a class-based society. And it evolved especially when we talk about Egypt, which is probably where the most of this work has been done. Ancient Egypt, the role of grains in ancient Egypt at the beginning, clearly, I wouldn't say clearly, but in the beginning, in my interpretation of the evidence, it was really to ensure that you could have a large enslaved population that was well fed, it wasn't hungry, but also wasn't doing well enough to revolt. They couldn't become an army, but they could lay the bricks for what would become the pyramids and so on, right? So the class discussion is a different discussion. In the context of thickness, in the context of if you are not thriving, please, for goodness sake, use a first principles approach. Get back to something like a human appropriate diet. Stay on that diet for 6 weeks or 6 months would be even better if you can. And only then take the next step and consider whatever it may be, whether it's even surgery, whether it's medications. I'm not saying that it's going to fix everything, but it is a necessary first step. So thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.